November 1944. A train car rattles through the frozen Massachusetts countryside carrying 67 German women who haven't eaten a real meal in 8 months. They're starving, terrified, and convinced they're being taken to their execution. But when the doors of Fort Devens open and they smell fresh coffee and bacon for the first time in years, everything they believed about their enemy is about to shatter. This is the true story of the breakfast that changed everything. The women had been captured across multiple theaters of the European War. Some were nurses caught behind enemy lines after D-Day. Others were radio operators, clerks, and auxiliary personnel swept up in the Allied advance through France and Belgium. Anneliese Müller, a 24-year-old nurse from Hamburg, had been treating wounded soldiers in a makeshift hospital near Caen when American paratroopers stormed through the doors. She remembered the moment vividly. The way the young soldiers had their rifles raised but their eyes filled with something she didn't expect. Hesitation, maybe even sympathy. The journey across the Atlantic had been brutal. Packed into the lower decks of a converted cargo ship, the women endured 2 weeks of rolling seas, limited rations, and the constant fear that a German U-boat might torpedo them without knowing prisoners were aboard. 19-year-old Liesel Schmidt spent most of the voyage curled in a corner, clutching a small photograph of her mother and younger brother. She had been an enthusiastic member of the Bund Deutscher Mädel, the girls' wing of the Hitler Youth, trained to operate communications equipment. Now she was an enemy of the state she'd been taught to serve, and she had no idea what awaited her on American soil. When they finally docked in Boston Harbor on a gray November morning, the cold hit them like a physical blow. Most of the women had only the threadbare uniforms they'd been captured in. Their shoes were falling apart. Many had lost significant weight during the crossing, their faces gaunt and eyes hollow. As they were loaded onto military trucks for the journey to Fort Devens, Anneliese noticed something strange. The American soldiers weren't rough with them. They didn't shout or shove. One young private even offered his jacket to an older woman who was shivering violently. Fort Devens sat about 40 miles northwest of Boston, a sprawling military installation that had been rapidly converted to house the unexpected influx of prisoners. The women's section was separated from the male POW compounds by multiple fences and guard towers. As the trucks rolled through the main gate, Sergeant Ruth O'Brien watched from her post near the administration building. She was a 32-year-old former schoolteacher from South Boston, who had joined the Women's Army Corps to do her part for the war effort. She'd requested assignment to the POW detail specifically because she spoke some German, learned from her grandmother who had immigrated before the First World War. The processing took hours. Each woman was photographed, fingerprinted, and given a cursory medical examination. Dr. Helen Foster, a no-nonsense physician from Chicago, was shocked by what she found. Malnutrition was universal. Many had untreated injuries. Several showed signs of tuberculosis. She made careful notes, documenting everything, knowing these records might be important for future war crimes tribunals. But as she examined each frightened face, she couldn't help feeling something beyond professional duty. These were human beings, most of them barely adults, caught up in a conflict they probably never fully understood. Frau Hanna Becker was different from the younger women. At 41, she had been a mid-level administrator in the Reich Labor Service, responsible for coordinating female work assignments in occupied France. She carried herself with rigid dignity even in captivity, her back straight, her expression carefully neutral. She had been a true believer in National Socialism, convinced of German superiority and the righteousness of the war. Unlike the frightened younger women around her, Hannah showed no emotion during processing. She answered questions with clipped precision and refused to make eye contact with her captors. By late afternoon, the processing was complete. The women were led to their barracks, simple wooden structures with rows of metal bunks. Each woman received 2 wool blankets, a pillow, and a small locker for personal belongings. The barracks were heated, another surprise. In the camps and temporary facilities they'd occupied in Europe, heat had been a luxury reserved for officers. Here, even prisoners had warm spaces to sleep. Ruth O'Brien and 2 other female guards supervised as the women settled in. Ruth watched them carefully, noting who seemed to be natural leaders, who was most frightened, who might cause trouble. Her eyes kept returning to the older woman, Hannah, who had chosen a bunk in the corner and sat ramrod straight staring at nothing. As evening approached, Captain Edward Hayes called his staff together for a briefing. Hayes was a career officer, 47 years old, who had seen action in World War I and understood the complexities of warfare better than most. He had specific instructions from the War Department regarding treatment of prisoners, instructions that reflected America's commitment to the Geneva Conventions, even when the enemy didn't always reciprocate. Hayes was clear with his staff. These women would be treated with dignity and respect. They would receive the same rations as American soldiers. They would have access to medical care, recreational activities, and even educational programs. They were prisoners, yes, but they were also human beings entitled to humane treatment under international law. Some of his male officers grumbled about coddling the enemy, but Hayes shut that down immediately. America would win this war, he told them, but it would win it without compromising its values. That night the women barely slept. They whispered to each other in the darkness, sharing fears and rumors. Some were convinced they would be executed at dawn. Others thought they'd be used as slave labor in American factories. Liesl cried quietly into her thin pillow, overwhelmed by homesickness and terror. Annalisa lay awake, her nurse's mind cataloging the injuries and illnesses she'd observed among her fellow prisoners. She wondered if the Americans would provide medical treatment or simply let them suffer. Only Hannah seemed unmoved by the uncertainty. She had been trained to show no weakness, to maintain discipline even in the worst circumstances. But in the privacy of her own thoughts, doubts were beginning to creep in. The Americans had been almost courteous during processing. No one had struck her. No one had screamed in her face. It didn't match what she'd been told about the barbaric, mongrel Americans who supposedly had no culture or discipline. Morning came early. At 6 o'clock, whistles blew, and lights came on. The women stirred slowly, stiff and sore from the uncomfortable bunks and the stress of the previous day. Ruth O'Brien entered the barracks with 2 other guards and announced in accented German that it was time for breakfast. The women formed a ragged line and were marched across the compound to a large mess hall. The smell hit them before they even entered the building. Fresh coffee, bacon, bread baking. For women who had survived on watery soup and moldy bread for months, the aroma was almost painful. Some of them actually stopped walking, overwhelmed by the scent of real food. The guards had to gently encourage them to keep moving. Inside the mess hall, Private Michael Wilson and his kitchen crew had been working since 4 in the morning. Michael was 23 from a small farm in Iowa, and he'd grown up believing that food was love made visible. When he'd been told he'd be serving German POWs, his first thought had been about making sure they got decent meals. His mother had taught him that you could tell everything about a person's character by how they treated people who couldn't fight back. The women filed through the serving line in stunned silence. Each received a metal tray loaded with scrambled eggs, bacon, toast with butter and jam, fried potatoes, and a cup of hot coffee with real sugar and cream available. Many of them stared at their trays as if they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Some started crying immediately. Liesl's hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped her tray. A young American soldier steadied it for her with a gentle smile and said something she didn't understand, but his tone was kind. She made her way to a table and sat down, just staring at the food. Around her, other women were having similar reactions. Some ate slowly, savoring every bite. Others devoured everything so quickly they made themselves sick. Annalisa forced herself to eat slowly, knowing her shrunken stomach couldn't handle too much rich food at once. But with each bite, she felt something shifting inside her. This wasn't how you treated people you planned to execute. This wasn't how you treated people you considered subhuman. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. Everything she'd been told about the Americans, all the propaganda about their cruelty and degeneracy, was being contradicted by scrambled eggs and bacon. At a table near the back, Elsa Koch, a 53-year-old former schoolteacher who had been conscripted into clerical work for the Wehrmacht, was weeping openly. She had lost 30 pounds during her captivity in France and the journey to America. She had been certain she would die, had made peace with it. Now she was eating eggs cooked with butter, drinking real coffee, and she couldn't process the contradiction. A young guard approached her, concerned, but Elsa couldn't explain through her tears. Hannah Becker ate mechanically, her face expressionless, but inside, her carefully constructed worldview was beginning to crack. She had been taught that Americans were weak, decadent, racially inferior, yet here they were, feeding their enemies better than Germany had fed its own citizens in years. It didn't make sense. It challenged everything she believed about strength and superiority. After breakfast, the women were given time to rest and digest. Many of them were physically ill from eating rich food after months of starvation rations. Dr. Foster made rounds providing antacids and advice about eating smaller portions until their bodies adjusted. She was patient and kind, explaining things in simple German that Ruth O'Brien helped translate when necessary. It was during this recovery period that Liesel finally voiced the question that had been building in all of them. She was sitting on her bunk, still feeling the warmth of the coffee in her belly, when she turned to Annalisa and asked in a confused whisper, "Are we really prisoners?" The question spread through the barracks like wildfire. Are we really prisoners? How could they be prisoners when they were being treated better than they'd been treated by their own army? When they had warm beds and full stomachs and doctors who actually cared if they were sick? The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming for women who had been raised on propaganda about American brutality. Ruth O'Brien heard the question being repeated and brought it to Captain Hayes. He considered it carefully, then asked her to gather the women for an address. That afternoon, all 67 German POWs assembled in the mess hall. Hayes stood before them, Ruth translating his words into German. He explained that yes, they were prisoners of war. They were being held under the authority of the United States Army and the provisions of the Geneva Convention. They would remain imprisoned until the war ended and arrangements could be made for their repatriation. But while they were in American custody, they would be treated with the dignity and respect that all human beings deserved. They would work, but only at tasks appropriate for women and only under safe conditions. They would be paid a small wage for their labor. They would have access to medical care, education, and recreation. They would be allowed to write letters home, subject to censorship. They would not be abused, starved, or mistreated. Hayes paused, letting Ruth's translation catch up, then added something that wasn't in his official script. He said that America was fighting for certain principles, certain values about human dignity and freedom. Those values didn't disappear just because someone wore a different uniform. America would prove its superiority not through cruelty, but through justice and compassion. The women listened in stunned silence. Some were skeptical, convinced this was some kind of trick. Others were cautiously hopeful. A few, like Liesel, were openly crying. Hannah Becker sat with her arms crossed, her face unreadable, but something in her eyes had changed. Over the following days and weeks, the reality of their situation became clearer. The women were assigned to various work details: laundry, kitchen assistants, clerical work, and light manufacturing. They worked 8-hour days with breaks and weekends off. They were paid 10 cents per day in camp script that could be used at the canteen for toiletries, writing paper, and small luxuries. The food continued to be abundant and nutritious. 3 meals a day, every day, with portions that would have seemed impossible in wartime Germany. Michael Wilson took pride in his cooking, often adding special touches like fresh-baked cookies or apple pie. He didn't see enemy soldiers when he looked at the women in the serving line. He saw hungry people who deserved a decent meal. Medical care was comprehensive. Dr. Foster treated everything from minor colds to serious conditions like tuberculosis. She arranged for dental work, eyeglasses, and even minor surgeries when necessary. The women who had arrived malnourished and sick began to gain weight and regain their health. The transformation was visible within weeks. Annalisa was assigned to work in the camp infirmary, assisting Dr. Foster. It was strange at first, working alongside her former enemy, but the two women quickly developed a professional rapport based on their shared commitment to healing. Dr. Foster was impressed by Annalisa's competence and dedication. Annalisa was moved by Dr. Foster's genuine compassion for her patients, regardless of nationality. Liesel was assigned to clerical work in the administration building. Her neat handwriting and attention to detail made her valuable for filing and record-keeping. She worked under the supervision of a middle-aged American sergeant who treated her with gruff kindness, occasionally sharing photographs of his own daughter back home in Ohio. Slowly, Liesel's fear began to transform into something else. Not quite trust, not yet, but a tentative sense of safety. Ruth O'Brien found herself drawn to the prisoners' stories. During her rounds, she would sometimes sit and talk with the women, practicing her German and learning about their lives before the war. She was struck by how ordinary they were, how similar to her own students back in Boston. They weren't monsters or fanatics, just regular people caught up in circumstances beyond their control. Hannah Becker remained aloof and resistant. She performed her assigned work in the laundry facility with mechanical efficiency, but refused to engage in friendly conversation with guards or other prisoners who were becoming too comfortable with their captors. She saw their acceptance as weakness, as betrayal of the Reich, but privately, in the quiet hours of the night, she couldn't stop thinking about the contradictions she was experiencing. One evening in December, about a month after their arrival, the camp organized a Christmas celebration for the prisoners. There was a decorated tree in the mess hall, carols singing, and special holiday meals. The American staff had even arranged for small gifts, warm socks, writing paper, bars of chocolate. It was more than many of the women had experienced in years of wartime austerity in Germany. Liesel sat near the Christmas tree, holding her bar of chocolate like it was made of gold, and cried, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming confusion of being shown kindness by people she'd been taught to hate. Anneliese sat beside her, putting an arm around the younger woman's shoulders, understanding completely because she felt the same way. Even Hannah was affected, though she tried not to show it. She stood in the corner of the mess hall, watching the celebration with her usual stern expression. But when the women began singing Stille Nacht in German and the American guards joined in with Silent Night in English, something broke inside her. She didn't cry, but her rigid posture softened slightly, and for the first time since her capture, she allowed herself to feel something other than defiant loyalty to a cause that was beginning to seem very far away. Captain Hayes watched the celebration with quiet satisfaction. This was what victory should look like, he thought. Not cruelty and domination, but the triumph of humanistic values over barbarism. These women would return to Germany someday, and they would carry with them the memory of how America had treated them. That memory might do more to prevent future wars than any peace treaty. As winter deepened, life in the camp settled into a routine. The women worked, ate well, attended educational classes offered by the camp, and slowly began to heal both physically and psychologically. Letters from home began arriving, heavily censored but still precious connections to the world they'd left behind. The news from Germany was increasingly grim. Cities bombed, armies in retreat, food shortages reaching catastrophic levels. Anneliese received a letter from her mother in Hamburg describing the devastation of Allied bombing raids. The contrast between her mother's descriptions of hunger and cold and her own situation as a well-fed prisoner was almost unbearable. She felt guilty for having enough to eat while her family suffered, but she also felt a growing awareness that the war Germany had started was coming home to roost, and the suffering was a direct consequence of the aggression her nation had unleashed. Liesel's letters from home stopped coming in January. She waited anxiously every mail call, but nothing arrived. Ruth O'Brien noticed her distress and gently suggested that mail service from Germany was increasingly disrupted by the war. It might be weeks or months before letters got through. Liesel nodded, trying to be brave, but the fear that something had happened to her family was overwhelming. Ruth stayed with her that evening, just sitting quietly, offering the comfort of presence when words weren't enough. In February 1945, news reached the camp that Allied forces had crossed the Rhine. The war was clearly entering its final phase. The German prisoners received the news with mixed emotions. They wanted the war to end, wanted to go home, but they also feared what would happen to their country in defeat. Would Germany be destroyed? Would they have homes to return to? Hannah Becker's transformation was slow and subtle, but it was happening. She began to participate in some of the educational classes, particularly an English language course taught by one of the American officers. She told herself it was practical, that knowing English might be useful in the post-war world. But really, it was her way of beginning to engage with a reality she could no longer deny. The Americans weren't monsters. They weren't inferior. They had defeated Germany not through barbarism, but through industrial might, organizational skill, and yes, through the moral authority that came from treating even their enemies with basic human decency. One afternoon in March, Anneliese was working in the infirmary when a young American soldier was brought in with a severe cut from a kitchen accident. Dr. Foster was in a meeting, so Anneliese handled the emergency herself, cleaning and suturing the wound with practiced efficiency. The soldier was nervous about being treated by a German, but Anneliese's competence and gentle manner quickly put him at ease. When Dr. Foster returned and saw what Anneliese had done, She praised her work publicly. The soldier thanked Annalisa sincerely, shaking her hand like she was a colleague, not an enemy. That moment crystallized something for Annalisa. The war had made them enemies, but it didn't make them different species. Under the uniforms and the flags and the propaganda, they were all just human beings trying to survive and do their jobs. The Americans had understood this from the beginning. It had taken her months of being treated with dignity to finally accept it. In April, news came that President Roosevelt had died. The camp observed a day of mourning, flags at half-staff, and a memorial service. The German prisoners were not required to attend, but many did, standing quietly at the back of the assembly. They might not have understood everything Roosevelt represented, but they understood loss and the solemnity of death. Ruth O'Brien was moved to see them there, showing respect even for the leader of the nation that held them captive. The end came suddenly in May. On the 8th, Captain Hayes assembled all the prisoners and announced that Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. The women received the news in stunned silence. It was over. Years of fighting, millions dead, entire cities destroyed, and now it was simply over. Some women cried from relief, others from grief for what had been lost. Hannah Becker stood very still, her face pale, processing the complete collapse of everything she had believed in. The question now was what would happen to them. Repatriation wouldn't be immediate. Germany was in chaos, divided into occupation zones, its infrastructure destroyed. It might be months before arrangements could be made to send prisoners home. In the meantime, life in the camp continued much as before, but something had shifted. With the war over, the women were no longer enemies, just displaced persons waiting to go home. The relationship between prisoners and guards became more relaxed, more human. Friendships developed that would have been impossible during active combat. Ruth O'Brien and Annalisa began meeting regularly to practice languages, Ruth improving her German and Annalisa working on her English. They talked about their lives, their hopes, their fears for the future. Michael Wilson organized a victory celebration in the mess hall, but it was a subdued affair. Yes, the Allies had won, but everyone was aware of the tremendous cost. The women were grateful the killing had stopped, but they faced an uncertain future in a defeated, devastated homeland. The American staff tried to be sensitive to these mixed emotions. In June, Liesl finally received a letter from home. Her mother and brother had survived, though their house had been destroyed in a bombing raid. They were living with relatives in the countryside. The relief Liesl felt was overwhelming. She shared the news with Ruth, who hugged her spontaneously, both women crying together, united in their relief that this one family had survived the catastrophe. Hannah Becker requested a private meeting with Captain Hayes. Through Ruth's translation, she told him that she wanted to apologize. Not for serving her country, she still believed in patriotism and duty, but for the blindness that had prevented her from seeing the truth. She had believed in German superiority, in the righteousness of the Nazi cause, and she had been wrong. The Americans had shown her through their actions what true strength looked like. It wasn't domination and cruelty. It was justice tempered with mercy. It was the ability to treat your enemies with dignity, even when you had every reason and opportunity to do otherwise. Hayes listened carefully, then told her through Ruth that he appreciated her words. He said that the world would need people like her in the years ahead, Germans who had learned from their mistakes and were willing to build a better future. Germany would rise again, he believed, but it needed to rise as a democracy committed to human rights and international cooperation. People like Hannah, who had experienced both the brutality of totalitarianism and the justice of democratic values, would be crucial to that rebuilding. The repatriation process began in July. The women would be sent home in groups, processed through reception centers in the American occupation zone of Germany. Annalisa was in the first group scheduled to leave. Her last day at Fort Devens was emotional. Dr. Foster gave her a letter of recommendation, stating that she was a skilled and compassionate nurse who would be an asset to any medical facility. Ruth O'Brien gave her a small package of food for the journey and a photograph of the two of them together, taken by one of the guards. As Annalisa prepared to board the truck that would take her to the port, she turned back to look at the camp one last time. This place where she had been a prisoner had also been the place where she had been treated with more dignity and respect than she'd experienced in her own country's service. She would never forget that. She would carry the memory of American kindness back to Germany and use it to help rebuild a better nation. Liesel left in August, clutching her letters from home and the small savings she'd accumulated from her work wages. She was eager to see her family, but also sad to leave. Fort Devens had been a strange sanctuary, a place where she'd been safe and cared for during the most terrifying period of her life. She hugged Ruth goodbye, promising to write, knowing they probably wouldn't stay in touch, but meaning it sincerely in the moment. Hannah was among the last to leave in September. She had requested the delay, wanting to complete the English course and some other educational programs. On her final day, she sought out Captain Hayes to thank him personally. In halting English, she told him that he had changed her life. He had shown her that strength and compassion were not opposites but complements. She would spend the rest of her life trying to live up to the example he and his staff had set. By October 1945, the women's section of Fort Devens was empty. The barracks were cleaned and repurposed for other uses. The camp returned to its normal military functions. But the impact of those months rippled outward in ways both large and small. Annalisa returned to Hamburg and found work in a hospital serving the occupation forces. Her letter of recommendation from Dr. Foster opened doors that would have otherwise been closed to a former enemy combatant. She worked tirelessly to help rebuild Germany's shattered medical infrastructure, always remembering the lessons she'd learned about treating every patient with dignity, regardless of who they were. Liesel reunited with her family and eventually became a teacher, like Elsa Koch had been before the war. She taught her students about the importance of questioning authority, of thinking critically, of recognizing propaganda. She never spoke much about her time as a prisoner, but it informed everything she did in the classroom. Hannah Becker became involved in the reconstruction of democratic institutions in West Germany. She worked with American occupation authorities to establish local governance structures and educational programs. She was never a prominent figure, but she was effective, using her organizational skills to help build the foundations of what would become a stable democratic nation. Ruth O'Brien returned to teaching in Boston but stayed in the Army Reserve. She often thought about the German women she'd guarded, wondering what had become of them. She had learned as much from them as they had from her. Lessons about the common humanity that persists even in wartime, about the power of small acts of kindness to change hearts and minds. Dr. Helen Foster continued her military medical career, eventually retiring as a colonel. She never forgot the malnourished, frightened women she'd examined that first day at Fort Devens, or the healthy, hopeful women they'd become. It reinforced her belief that healing was about more than just treating physical ailments. It was about restoring dignity and hope. Michael Wilson went back to his family farm in Iowa, but he stayed in touch with several of his fellow kitchen staff. They would sometimes talk about the German prisoners, about how strange it had felt to serve good meals to enemy soldiers, but also how right it had felt. They had fought a war, yes, but they had fought it as Americans, which meant holding fast to certain values even when it would have been easier to abandon them. Captain Edward Hayes retired from the Army in 1946 and wrote a memoir about his experiences managing POW camps. The book wasn't widely read, but it influenced military policy regarding treatment of prisoners in future conflicts. Hayes argued that America's greatest strength wasn't its weapons or its industrial capacity, but its commitment to principles that transcended the immediate demands of war. The question, "Are we really prisoners?" became something of a legend among those who had been there. It captured perfectly the cognitive dissonance of being treated humanely by an enemy you'd been taught to hate and fear. It represented the moment when propaganda collided with reality, and reality won. Years later, historians would study the American POW system during World War II, and note its general adherence to international law and humanitarian principles. There were failures and abuses, to be sure, particularly in the immediate aftermath of combat. But overall, America had treated its prisoners far better than most nations in that conflict, and certainly better than the Axis powers had treated theirs. The women of Fort Devens were a small part of that larger story, but their experiences illustrated important truths about the nature of warfare and humanity. They showed that it's possible to fight fiercely against an enemy while still recognizing their fundamental human dignity. They demonstrated that how you treat people in your power reveals your true character more than how you treat your equals or superiors. The breakfast that had shocked them so deeply that first morning, the eggs and bacon and coffee that had seemed impossible after months of starvation, was more than just food. It was a statement of values. It was America saying, We are strong enough to be generous, secure enough to be just, confident enough to show mercy. In the decades after the war, as Germany rebuilt and transformed into a stable democracy and a key American ally, the seeds planted during those months of captivity bore fruit in ways both tangible and intangible. The women who had been prisoners at Fort Devens and camps like it returned home with a different understanding of what America represented. They had experienced firsthand the difference between the totalitarian system they'd served and the democratic values of their former enemy. This wasn't naive idealism or propaganda. It was the hard-won knowledge that comes from lived experience. They had been hungry and were fed. They had been sick and were healed. They had been frightened and were treated with patience and respect. These simple acts of human decency, repeated day after day, had power that no amount of propaganda could match. The story of the German POW women in America is a reminder that, even in the darkest times, even in the midst of total war, it's possible to hold fast to principles of human dignity and justice. It's a reminder that how we treat our enemies defines us as much as how we treat our friends. And it's a reminder that small acts of kindness and mercy can have ripples that extend far beyond the immediate moment, shaping the future in ways we can barely imagine. So when those women asked, "Are we really prisoners?" they were asking something profound. They were questioning everything they'd been taught about strength and weakness, about superiority and inferiority, about what it means to win and what it means to lose. And the answer they discovered, through eggs and bacon and coffee and compassion, was that yes, they were prisoners, but they were also human beings deserving of dignity. And that made all the difference. If you found this story powerful, please subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from history. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on this remarkable chapter of World War II, and hit that like button to help others discover these important lessons from the past.